Candace, we ready to go?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you kindly. And thank you all for being here and waiting so patiently. Good afternoon and good evening to those currently rotating a little further from the sun. My name is Lulu Matute, and on behalf of the SOA Watch staff collective, our council and longtime community, I want to welcome you to this book talk featuring author, researcher, and organizer, Dr. Maha Hilal. This webinar is scheduled for the next hour and 15 minutes, and will kick off with a visual timeline of the war on terror, which starts at 9/11 and ends with Biden's withdrawal of US troops in Afghanistan. After the visual timeline, we'll jump into a discussion with the author, and lastly, my team member, Candace, who has worked out the tech. Thank you, Candace. She will be supporting us in closing the space and leading the book raffle and final announcements. Now, before we get into the visual timeline, I want to acknowledge that this is a very difficult subject to talk about. War, fear-mongering, hatred, the complicity to human suffering, the monetization and manipulation of violence as a tool of power are among the ugliest parts of humanity. But that's not all there is for us, and we know that well. We, as witnesses and organizers in social movement spaces, we know resilience and resistance. We know what solidarity across communities and struggles looks like. And that's why we come together in shared spaces like these, to exchange ideas that can inform our movement towards peace, justice, and human dignity. For 32 years and counting, the SOA Watch has brought together communities to demand an end to US-led wars against impoverished Black and brown bodies. We recognize that real power doesn't come from gun barrels, but rather from people coming together to do better by one another, not in spite of our difference, but because of them. And this is our strength. We ground ourselves in our commitment to nonviolence, to human rights, and to the protection of life, land, and water. With that, I invite us all here today to share a grounding breath. Let's inhale for peace and exhale for power. This here is our common ground, and we thank you, Dr. Hilal, and everyone here today for sharing in this space. Now, Candace, if you would please cue up the visual timeline. And while this is playing, I invite folks in the chat to please share your reactions to the timeline as you see it. All right, and Candace will be sharing that now. Thank you. All right. I'm seeing some reactions coming in the chat. Matthew says, so powerful. I didn't know ICE was created post 9/11. And John shares, seeing this condensed chronology offers a powerful message that challenges all to take action and end such hatred-based policymaking. Murtada shares, very well made. And I will move on to introducing one of the creators who participated in the production of that timeline and the author of Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Dr. Maha Hilal. She's a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia and the author of the book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Her writings have appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, and Truthout, among other publications. She is one of the co-founders of the Justice for Muslim Collective and was the inaugural Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she produced research and writing on the consequences of the war on terror on the Muslim community. Dr. Hilal is also an organizer with Witness Against Torture and a council member of the School of the Americas Watch. She earned her doctorates from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in DC, her master's in counseling, and her bachelor's in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, let's dive into questions and discussions. Dr. Hilal, let's start by defining the terms you discuss in your book. What is the war on terror and what is Islamophobia?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to SOA Watch for inviting me for this book talk. Thank you to Candice, who's running our tech, and thank you to Lulu for the introduction and for being willing to facilitate this event. Before I answer that question, I just want to reflect just quickly about the timeline. So the timeline is an idea that I conceived of and conceptualized. And the reason I wanted to create the timeline is, for one, to kind of see the spectrum of the laws and policies through Muslim eyes and really focus on the disproportionate impact of the war on terror on the Muslim community. Second, as we'll probably get into later in the talk, one of the things that, one of the perceptions of the war on terror that I think is pretty common is that it has really just involved what happens overseas or abroad, that it's about US militarism abroad. But what I wanted to do with this timeline is show the range of ways and the range of policies and laws that have been implemented, not just abroad, but also domestically. So in doing that, kind of recognizing and understanding the connections with how we see the war on terror and really the question of like, how did we get to where we are today? I think if we see this timeline, that question and the answer to that question becomes a lot more clear. So what is the war on terror? So the war on terror was launched after the 9/11 attacks. The term war on terror was used, and we'll bring up the quote in a second. The term war on terror was used for the first time by former President Bush on September 20th of 2001 in a speech meant to address a joint session of Congress and the American people, basically outlining what would happen, how the US would respond to the 9/11 attacks. The war on terror was framed, right, as a campaign that was aimed at targeting this, quote, terrorist threat, specifically to the free world, i.e. Western countries, and those who believe in democracy. Like I just said, the war on terror has been narrowly conceived and intentionally constructed as one that is simply fought abroad. But in fact, the war on terror has always been a multi-dimensional campaign that includes domestic counterterrorism policies. So it's really important. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how we can take a broader picture and really capture the totality of the war on terror beyond simply looking at militarism and warfare abroad. And then, Lulu, you asked about Islamophobia as well.
Yes,
Candace, can you switch?
thank you.
So when we talk about Islamophobia, there seems to be, more or less a general understanding of what it is, just in terms of the targeting of Muslims. In my book, however, I'm concerned with a specific form of Islamophobia, and that is institutionalized Islamophobia. In other words, the ways in which this form of oppression is deeply embedded into the laws and policies of the war on terror. Now, when we use the term Islamophobia, right, there's this idea, of course, of phobia. Some people and some organizations, Muslims, have spoken about this fear as being irrational. I, however, talk about the fear as being contrived. The government is contriving fear of Muslims in order to justify the use of brutal tactics and interventions to combat this, quote, terrorist threat that is conflated with Muslims. So this is built into the structures of the state and society. This is intentional. It's also based on a social construction of Islam. I talk a lot in the book about social constructions, and specifically how these constructions enter into policy discourse and policy design and implementation, and what that outcome is based on those constructions. Some of you are probably familiar with ideas about Islam and negative tropes that suggest that Islam and Muslims are violent. It's a barbaric religion. Muslims are barbaric, we're uncivilized, and opposed to normative democratic values. If you've been paying attention to Russia's war on Ukraine and the refugees that have left the Ukraine, right, and have gone to other countries, many of these countries have talked about accepting Ukrainian refugees as sort of a moral duty or an obligation. And then they juxtapose it to the uncivilized Muslims who don't deserve or belong within their borders. Additionally, Islamophobia is about Muslims existing outside of moral boundaries. When you have moral boundaries within your community, there's a certain sort of justice and fairness that you consider members of your moral community to be owed. But when groups are placed outside of those communities and boundaries, it then becomes easier to abuse, torture, murder, and do whatever else to those groups. And that's precisely what has happened in the war on terror, because of how deeply dehumanized Muslims have been. And then finally, one of the complicating things about Islamophobia, and bear in mind that not everyone refers to what I'm talking about as Islamophobia. Some people use anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim bias, but I use Islamophobia very intentionally because I think it really centers the anti-religious animus. But at the same time, it of course bears noting that not all Muslims experience Islamophobia in the same way, because it intersects with other identities and other systems of oppression that are at play. So as I say in the definition, this anti-religious animus intersects with anti-Blackness, racism, cultural racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. And so it's really important when we talk about this sort of Muslim experience that we understand that there isn't actually one Muslim experience, that Muslims experience Islamophobia very differently, being that it is such a diverse community. But nevertheless, there are these sort of omnipresent tropes and stereotypes about Muslims that are applied to and weaponized against members of the community.
And Dr. Hilal, can you speak to how the US government communicated and articulated the goals of the war on terror and how that was rooted in Islamophobia?
Candace, can you go to the next slide? So this is the quote I mentioned earlier, and this is a quote that I often actually start presentations with. And so again, this is from a speech that former President Bush gave on September 20th of 2001, in which he said, quote, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated," end quote. So this is a very broad goal for this war on terror, right? And obviously it would be nearly impossible to eliminate the terrorist threat, especially if we consider that the United States is never reflective of the role it plays in perpetuating, reproducing, and instigating conflict. What I really focus on in this quote is that what it was essentially saying is not just that we're not going to stop until all these terrorists are defeated, but that basically we're going to do whatever it takes to do that. And as he illustrated in the remainder of his speech, there was no inhibitions. There were no barriers. There was nothing telling the Bush administration that you cannot do this because it is illegal. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about where we are today and how we got to this place in terms of the trajectory of the war on terror, I consider this quote as part of the blueprint of the war on terror. Even if it wasn't extremely specific in terms of what the war on terror would entail, it was nevertheless outlining the scope of the war, the endlessness of the war, and the lack of barriers in terms of what tools could be used by the US government to fight this war.
And can you speak to the role of this narrative in facilitating state violence against the communities?
Yes. So I spent a lot of time talking about narrative in the book. And the reason is because narrative serves a very specific purpose when it comes to any war, but of course the one I have been focused on is the war on terror. Narrative is extremely important in justifying and legitimizing abuse of Muslims. Narrative was important in the early days after 9/11 because of the work that was done to really tell the story of the 9/11 attacks, who was responsible, why they committed the 9/11 attacks. Often the explanation was they hated our freedoms, right? They hate our democracy. So these narratives are really crucial in telling people, at least in this case, the American public, who it is that we're fighting against. And for example, in the same speech on September 20th, Bush said specifically that Americans are asking tonight, why did they hate us? Were Americans actually asking that? And if they weren't, they were now going to start asking that, because that is the power and the role of narrative, to prime people. And in the aftermath of such a tragic attack, exploiting their vulnerabilities and fear to produce a story that leads only to the conclusion that the war on terror must be fought in the terms that Bush had laid out. Of course, one of the ways that this narrative
Mhm.
is really important is when we talk about constructions. How are Muslims constructed, right? How is terrorism constructed? And who is that crime attributed to? How do we use narrative to wed a group of people to a particular type of crime? In this slide that's up, there are two quotes. The first is from former President Bush on September 11th of 2001, in which he said, quote, "Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature," end quote. Second, a quote from Obama about 13 years later, in which he said, quote, "We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge," end quote. Now, you can see in the middle that there's a picture, and this is actually graffiti in Yemen, where there's a drone plane that says US drones. And then on the bottom, it says, "Why did you kill my family?" This slide to me is about the juxtaposition and the power of narrative. Whoever gets to define who is evil, who is violent, is the one that actually gets to wage and leverage the violence. In both of these quotes, talking about evil, evil is used to mean that it's inherent. This is an inherent characteristic of the people that we are talking about. And because it's inherent, that limits the interventions that we can utilize, because you cannot rationalize with someone who is evil. That will not work. And this juxtaposition is meant to highlight, right, the contradiction of the state describing, presumably, right, non-state actors as evil, while at the same time using drones to kill people in other countries for no crimes whatsoever. And the important part about narrative here is what I often think about, is if you didn't know who the speaker was, who the quote was attributed to, would these quotes also define and describe US state violence? And the answer is absolutely. So this is extremely important and something I really hone in on, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, just to add a little bit more to this answer, mm-hmm. When, you know, different atrocities have happened in the course of the war on terror, there's always this exception that's made for the United States. This is not who we are, right? No matter how many times you say it's not who we are, and of course that doesn't amount to a systemic pattern apparently, but the idea is that the United States can use that narrative to make its violence seem exceptional. It's not something that usually happens. Moreover, it positions its violence as morally superior, because that's what makes the state legitimate, is that it has a monopoly on the use of force. And because of that, or at least that idea, then state violence is deemed as inherently moral, whereas non-state actor violence is inherently immoral. If you look at, again, this slide, what is moral about state violence vis-a-vis drones that are killing innocent children, women, and men? What is morally superior about that? Yes, Pastor.
Yeah, and throughout the book, Dr. Hilal, you describe the dehumanization of Muslim communities in a way that is coupled with the humanization of Americans. And I think that's where you're getting at with how the narrative changes on what is moral when it's the state talking about violence in particular. So the dehumanization of them involves the humanization of us for the state. And what are some more of those examples of dehumanization of Muslims throughout the war?
So there was a quote, and I don't have it offhand. I think it was Dick Cheney, I want to say. Mm-hmm. And essentially, what he did was blame the terrorists for any violence that they so the community that was sort of sharing the same identities of quote terrorists, mm-hmm. blaming them for any violence that was directed at them by the US government, because it was their fault to begin with. So no matter what the United States does, even if it's disproportionate, even if it's a war crime, it's always the fault of someone else. Because in the US's mind, they are not the provocateur. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we can talk about that for hours, right? Because when we look at the history of this country, right, 9/11 is not when US history started, although that narrative and rhetoric was repeatedly used by President Bush, that this is about making history, this is about shaping the course of history. But history doesn't start when you want it to start. History is always there. And unfortunately, the United States continues to use this rhetoric and narrative to indicate and to assert again that its violence is either necessary and or legitimate, morally superior, and when they can't plausibly deny atrocities, that it was just a few bad apples. And you have to wonder at this point, who is the audience for those narratives? Right. Because there are many more people now that know the history of this country, and that there is a context that's always missing, and that it's in the interest of the government to present these issues in a vacuum, because that gives them more control over the story. Who are the protagonists? Who are the antagonists? Why did they, launch the 9/11 attacks? They can give all of these reasons, right, in a way that's more comprehensible.
Right. Yeah, and that's at the root of these debates over education, right? Over what information we have access to and what we learn, right? That's at the root of critical race theory arguments. Now, in your book, you outline 5 broad areas of policy and law that capture the full extent of the war and how it's played out over the last 20 years. What are these areas? And if you can provide some examples of each, let's start off with militarism and warfare.
Yes, absolutely. So, we talked a little bit earlier about what is the war on terror in terms of how it was sort of loosely defined in terms of the goals by President Bush after the 9/11 attacks. But we also talk about the war on terror ending, right? Last year, when the troops withdrew from Afghanistan, the Biden administration said that the war had ended. Okay, number one, the war didn't end because there were still troops and CIA activity to this day, of course, in Afghanistan. Number two, that is, of course, not even close to the extent of the war on terror. And because I'm often in abolitionist spaces, I'm an abolitionist myself, although one sort of who's learning a lot more about what this looks like. What does it mean to say we want to abolish the war on terror? That means we have to know what the war on terror really is. So thinking through the totality of the war on terror, I came to this conclusion and belief that, broadly speaking, there have been 5 dimensions of the war on terror. The first is militarism and warfare. Obviously, those are the more visible parts of the war on terror, right? When you think about the war on Iraq, the war on Afghanistan, drone warfare in Somalia, Pakistan, AFRICOM, the list goes on. Draconian immigration policies. We're all familiar with the Muslim ban. But in the beginning of the war on terror, one of the signature policies was called the National Special Entry Exit Registration System, in which Muslim males from 23 out of 25, so there was a list of 25 countries.
Mhm.
23 of the 25 countries were Muslim majority countries. And Muslim males of a certain age were made to register.
Right.
And of course, that is to create fear, right? To make people aware of their precarious status in this country, right? And one of the things that was really important in what the Bush administration did in this regard is to really connect criminality to immigration. Third, surveillance. There has been a policy or a program called Countering Violent Extremism that was really brought to life under the Obama administration, which has taken many forms, but fundamentally, it's about this sort of preventative approach to terrorism and deputizing members of the community, in particular, the Muslim community, to surveil their family, their friends, their community members, and to look for signs of radicalization according to these, non-empirically sound models, thereby sort of dissolving the community bonds. And having this feeling, right, that you're always being watched.
Mm-hmm.
Not only does that mean you're being surveilled by the state, but the state is always efficient with its violence. And because of that, it knows that if surveillance is omnipresent, then they can instill within people a fear that leads them to self-surveil. Mm. And in that way, the state can do a lot less work. Mm. Then there's federal terrorism prosecutions. This has been a huge problem, both domestically and abroad. And a lot of the landscape of these federal terrorism prosecutions was this idea of preemptiveness. We have to catch people before they commit an act of violence. And people have been detained and criminalized for thought crimes. Others have specifically been entrapped by FBI informants. And when they go to court for their cases, the entrapment defense has never succeeded because the US government is able to argue successfully that had it not been for the informant, or in the absence of the informant, this person who they provoked into agreeing to commit an act of violence would have done it anyway, which of course is rooted in Islamophobia, because the premise is that Muslims are inherently violent, and it's not about whether they will commit a crime, it's about when. And finally is detention and torture. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the notorious prison that is Guantanamo Bay. That's just one of the sites of torture. In addition, in the earlier years of the war on terror from 2002 to 2009, the CIA ran a rendition, detention, and interrogation program in which they were allowed to detain people themselves, as opposed to just rendering them to other countries. And they had black sites around the world. Now, I know we have limited time, but the important thing to note with the torture piece of this is that in the Bush administration, there were lawyers essentially doing legal gymnastics to be able to come to an explanation or rationale as to why certain tactics that would normally be considered torture were not torture. And in fact, at one point, John Yoo, who worked for the Office of Legal Counsel, reasoned that in order for treatment to qualify as torture, it had to rise to the level of organ failure or death. That is a very high threshold. And this goes back to the dehumanization of Muslims, because even though these policies were not specifically stated as only applying to Muslims, in practice, that's exactly who it applied to.
Thank you for your response there. And in the book, you go into these different pieces of legislation, right? And how they were proposed, how they were rolled out and implemented, and of course, the impact on Muslim communities, which broaden the power of the executive government. Of course, this has led to the borderless and timeless aspect of the war, which you note has touched over or nearly 40% of the world, right? So domestic policy meant an increase in immigration restrictions, right? This conflation of immigration and criminality, detention creations, the no-fly list and surveillance, right? The self-monitoring that you talked about, and that vigilance within communities that functions to fracture communities and to create that distrust among cohesive communities, right? Therefore, doing the work of the government, right? Doing the work of the state. One measure you talk about that has had a huge impact on Muslim Americans has been the material support doctrine. Can you talk a bit more about this and how it's been used by the government?
Yes, absolutely. So the material support doctrine is not new, was not a new thing after 9/11, but it was greatly expanded. Initially, right, this referred to sort of more direct support for terrorism. After 9/11, there was a lot of leeway in terms of what that meant. So traditionally, this was seen strictly as providing weapons or direct financial support. But again, after 9/11, the idea and understanding and weaponization of material support greatly expanded. So for example, in a case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, the government reasoned, for example, that you could not provide nonviolent training to a terrorist organization because that would be considered material support for terrorism. Even if, again, you're providing nonviolent training, that qualifies as material support for terrorism. In addition, what the government one of the ways that this is used is this idea of the fungibility theory. So the idea is that if you donate money to an organization that has a violent wing, even if you're providing money for schools or healthcare, and think about contexts in which there is no other way or no other governing body through which support can be given, that is still material support for terrorism, because what you are doing is freeing up resources that they would have otherwise used on healthcare, schools, etc., that they can now redirect to their violent activities. So again, that is material support for terrorism. And one of the scariest things about this is that sort of in the beginning of the war on terror, there were a lot of Muslim charities that were shut down, and people were afraid, Muslims were afraid to donate to many organizations for fear that they would retroactively be charged with material support for terrorism in the event that an organization was deemed a terrorist organization. And that was a huge problem. And it really impacted Muslims' ability, right, to feel safe in giving donations and giving alms, which is actually one of the pillars of Islam. And more generally, right, to stand with and be in solidarity with community members who had faced this sort of targeting by the government.
Yeah. And that's so similar, right? This idea of material support and criminalizing anything that can aid a targeted element, an element who is deemed an enemy of the state, right? We see this criminalization of aid, of humanitarian work, of solidarity work show up in different places, right? We see it in the southern border, where faith-based communities are being targeted and criminalized for going out into the desert and leaving water for migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, displaced persons who would otherwise die in the desert, right? In the targeting of that humanitarian aid work, of that solidarity movement, it's something that we see in immigration. It's something that we see in the war on drugs and the war on terror alike. Now, considering that there have been different administrations that touch on the war on terror, can you speak to some of those differences in how Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden have talked about position the war on terror and how they conducted the war?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first important thing to note is that state violence is bipartisan, as has been the war on terror. It's hard to sort of empirically measure under which administration it has been the worst, because they have all leaned on different specific tactics. So for example, Bush was focused on wide-scale invasion and ground war, while Obama tried to escalate troop engagement, but really exponentially increased the use of drones.
Right.
Trump was focused on sort of, quote, ending wars, whatever that means. Of course, we have to add disclaimers, right? Mm-hmm. But he also increased the use of drones. So there was basically a toolbox, right? And each administration stuck with the same toolbox, but it was a matter of which tool they used more to fight this nebulous terrorist threat. Mm-hmm. I think what is often the case, right, is when we look at the rhetoric, and I did look at the rhetoric in the book, and there's in fact a book that maybe we can post on the Facebook event that specifically looked at the difference in rhetoric across Bush, Obama, and Trump. And of course, Trump was the most overtly Islamophobic president to preside over the war on terror. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily correlate, right, to being more violent in the war on terror, because we know that his predecessors, right, enacted state violence all the same. And in fact, when Obama was president, what really was a problem was that his rhetoric was actually very sympathetic in many cases towards Muslims, right? But in practice, what was happening behind closed doors was another story. And so I think the important thing to impart here is, again, that the war on terror and state violence is bipartisan, and that we have to really look beyond the rhetoric and the narrative in this case, in terms of the extent to which it disguises the level of violence that's being, perpetuated by each administration. And of course, now that we're under the Biden administration, right, we now have a new president fighting the war on terror. Mm-hmm. And I think what has been sort of illuminating about the Biden administration is that, one of the examples that comes to mind is the closure of Guantanamo Bay. And a lot of the issues that have impacted Muslims, that were impacting Muslims under the Obama administration, where Muslims are being targeted, are issues that Biden often speaks to as though he had nothing to do with the policies passed, right? And so that is a very specific use and intentional use of the narrative to disguise this, to say, I want to close Guantanamo Bay, right? Well, you also had a chance to close Guantanamo Bay under the Obama administration. So I think it's very important, again, to sort of really hone in on and be conscientious of this rootedness of state violence as bipartisan.
And after Biden pulled the troops out of Afghanistan, there was all this talk about, finally this 20-year war is over, right? But what does it mean for war to be over? What does it actually mean to end the war?
So it's interesting, right? Because there are two things, right, going on in this sort of American discourse. One is that we have these endless wars, and the other is that these wars are over. So let's talk about the first part, that the war in Afghanistan is over. Even if, for example, there were no troops or no military activity in Afghanistan, to me, war is not just about the absence of troops on the ground. I believe, and through the work that I've done, that war, you are in a state of war if you are living in constant precarity. You're in a state of war if you don't know when the United States will decide to enact their retributive justice. You're in a state of war when your country has been devastated to the point where you can't access social services, healthcare, education. And when we say the war is over, that really just means for Americans. It's for Americans to feel better about themselves. Because for all intents and purposes, we don't have to see the impacts of our wars. We can go on believing that this war was won, and that, depending on where to the extent to which you believe the narratives, that we helped certain countries, but the war on terror is not over and will not be over, right? Until there is a considerable recalibration of what national security means and how it's so rooted in Muslim dehumanization. Now, that's even if this war on terror can end. And we have to recognize that the war on terror has deeply rooted tentacles in almost every aspect of life. And so part of the challenge is extracting the war on terror and denormalizing the ways in which it has seeped into our everyday experiences. And when we talk about this idea of endless wars, to me, that sort of phrase is used to kind of distance the United States from the harm that it has done, right? To kind of say it's out of our control, as though there can be no solution, right? We don't know how to end this thing that we started. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because was the war on terror actually designed to end, right? And so I think in many ways, this comic here illustrates, right, that this war on terror will go on until infinity. And as I talk about more broadly and generally in my book, US wars don't end. They simply morph into new wars that preserve the brutality of wars past. And that is important to note, because this country is a fundamentally violent country. And the purpose of wars and subsequent wars is to target and become more efficient, again, at targeting marginalized communities and building, in this case, right, in the era we're in, technologies that make state violence more efficient and effective.
And with this morphing of a war, right, the rhetoric here in the US is very much the war is over for the US, right? But as we know, and as you just shared, that's not true for the rest of the world. And that's not true for Muslim communities who are continuously being targeted by the infrastructure that was created to criminalize and surveil Muslim communities. So would you say that, considering the role and the goals of the state, was the war on terror a failure or was it a success?
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot because last year, of course, was the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And so depending where you fell on the spectrum, you might either say that the war on terror was a success or that it was a failure. Mm-hmm. Now, the first thing you need to know in order to answer the question is, what was the goal of the war on terror? And do you believe that goal? So if we take the stated goal of the war on terror as being designed to combat the threat of terrorism? Sure, maybe it was a success. What we don't know, however, is how much violence. It's not a success in terms of how much violence was perpetrated in order to curb this terrorist threat, right? If that's even what it did. And I would say it hasn't at all. Also, because we have to think about, right, the US's role in perpetuating conflict. So how can you combat a sort of violence that your engagement in is further perpetuating? And so when we think about the success, right, the US government will say that there hasn't been, for example, an attack in X number of years, right? Maybe that's true because of counterterrorism efforts, maybe it's not. And we know in many cases that the US government has intentionally chosen to focus on entrapping Muslims instead of dealing with known threats. So I think the point here in this question is what is the rubric for assessing whether or not the war was a success or a failure? If we look at who profited, right? If we look at private contractors, military defense contractors, look at the ways that the US has basically now has a strong foothold in Africa, right? Has military bases all over the world. Of course, this is not just a post 9/11 thing. But if we look at the ways that the US has cemented its influence, its control, its power over many countries across the globe, then under these terms and through this lens, we could say the war on terror was a success. But it's not according to, again, what the stated and theoretical goals of the US government were. Does that answer the question, or is there more I should say about that?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Thank you for your response there. And I wanted to transition to a bit more conversation on Gitmo. And I wanted to learn a little bit more about, if you could share with us a bit more about your experience being one of few Muslims advocating for the closure of Guantanamo and an end to torture against the Muslim men being held there. Can you speak to that?
Yes, so thank you for that question. I have been involved in the work of closing Guantanamo, or trying to close Guantanamo and ending torture since 2007. Mm-hmm. And, I definitely think in the earlier days, there's a lot more fear.
Yeah.
And what the context that the war on terror has created for a lot of Muslims is one where people are only comfortable advocating for those who are deemed and constructed as totally and completely innocent. Mm-hmm. Of course, even if, and just because someone's guilty, if they are, that does not mean that they should be deprived of rights. Mm. But there is such fear, and there has been such fear of advocating for some of the men at Guantanamo on the basis and the construction of their criminality, that there hasn't been a lot of Muslim involvement. Mm. When I look at Guantanamo, I see it as one of the most problematic examples of toxic narratives of Muslims and toxic narratives of dehumanization, and the institutionalization of Islamophobia. Guantanamo is an emblem of institutionalized Islamophobia. And to me, one of the roles that Guantanamo is meant to play is to extend the boundaries of what is considered acceptable treatment of Muslims. Because that treatment, the torture, was so brutal that things that are short of that brutality will seem more benign. Mm. But nevertheless, you still know how far the US government will go to target and criminalize Muslims. And so to me, it has always been important to be part of the struggle to close Guantanamo and to end torture, because fundamentally, I believe it is such a clear example of Islamophobia. I also think, this innocence and guilt dichotomy, as I was sort of speaking to, is very problematic, right? And kind of ties into the construction of terrorism and those who are considered terrorists as irredeemable, right? Of course, there are many different groups in the US's criminal justice system that are deemed irredeemable. But terrorism seems to carry this very different and heavy weight of irredeemability. And in that case, what do you do, right? If someone is guilty because they're irredeemable, right? That's the construction. And so to me, part of Guantanamo, the work on Guantanamo, is to really challenge and push back on these very toxic narratives, right? Among them, that these people, that the men that have been detained there deserve rights regardless of their innocence or guilt. And we know the vast majority anyway have never been charged or tried for a crime.
Right. Thank you for your response there. We're a few minutes before our ending point, but, and we'll transition to Candace, if you can leave the raffle and just closing the space. But before we get to that, Dr. Hilal, are there any final thoughts that you would like to share about institutionalized and internalized Islamophobia and how that shows up in the organizing world?
Sure. So, internalized Islamophobia, right, is a form of internalized oppression. Obviously, it's present in many communities. And the reason it's so important to address is because of the fact that it often leads to members of the community who are being oppressed actually participating in state violence and injustice against their own community. And in that way, internalized Islamophobia emboldens institutionalized Islamophobia because it places people that are in the oppressed community in the halls of power, often rubber stamping problematic and demonizing policies under the guise that it isn't Islamophobic because there is a Muslim involved. At best. At worst, it is that Muslims themselves believe all of the negative tropes and problematic narratives that they have been exposed to and thought and meant to believe. And they therefore treat their community in the same way and in alignment with the state. And so for me in this book, it was very important to make this connection because we cannot dismantle institutionalized Islamophobia until we dismantle internalized Islamophobia, because the community that is being oppressed has to disengage and extract themselves from perpetrating and participating in the violence of the state.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal, and I'll share a comment that just came in, thanking you for a comprehensive narrative from the Muslim point of view. So thank you very much. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for being here and participating attentively and listening in. I highly recommend Innocent Until Proven Muslim as an organizer, as a Central American, Caribbean woman out in the front lines, also trying to address policy. We see the solidarity piece. We see that overlap with our communities. And it is a call to action for all of us to be together as community and step into action. And you're getting thank yous with gratitude for your wisdom, labor, and offering. And to Candace, if you can please lead us in the closing of the space and in the raffling of this wonderful piece of research and production by Dr. Hilal. So thank you for all your work and for all you do.
Thank you so much, Lulu, and thank you, Candace, again, and to SOA Watch for hosting this discussion.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Wow, I just feel so excited to be, part of this organization and just to know both of you and to be friends with both of you. So thank you for that presentation. One of the things, we are going to raffle off one of the books, so don't leave quite yet if you have like one more second. Just wanted to invite you this weekend. We've been doing a book club, and we're on Sunday, we'll be meeting again. We're meeting every other week. It's at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific. Look on our website if you want to sign up. We're doing border and rural right now, but we're really thinking that it would be very exciting to do innocent until proven Muslim next. So definitely get your copy of the book. The link is in the chat, and we'll be letting you know when we're getting that together, but it's going to be an amazing book club. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do the raffle. Can you all see this amazing screen of Wheel of Names? Sorry, it's going to be so much fun. I hope people are still here. Let's click to spin and see what happens.
All right. Knowledge is power. You're getting a book. All right.
Oh, wow, yeah. Valerie, are you still here? Let's see. Is Valerie? Yeah, Valerie. Hi.
Okay. We'll get your details so that we can send out the book for you, Valerie.
Valerie, I'll send you my email. Go ahead. You are the one. You're our book winner for today. Thank you so much for being here, to everyone. Valerie, I'll send you. Here is my email. But I have your information as well because you signed up for the webinar. But thank you all so much for being here. Take care of yourselves, of one another, and we have a lot of work to do. So it's nice to be in community together, and we'll talk to you soon.